After the widow dressed in black made her way down the aircraft ramp with the general who commands the U.S. military district that is the U.S. capital area, the District of Columbia, the family follows. Nancy Reagan, now 82 years old. From the belly of the aircraft, the casket will be taken by the military pallbearers to the hearse as Ms. Reagan looks on. And then, as mentioned earlier, the casket will later be transferred to the horse-drawn caisson for the procession through the streets of the Capitol to the Rotunda.
Ready, step, hot,
We go in on the balcony.
hot, 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 hot.
To the sounds of military cadence and the clomp of boots on the ground, the President's casket is moved to the hearse. My Country 'Tis of Thee was specifically selected by the Reagans, President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan, to be played in California as the President's body arrived at his library, and again today at this spot in time. It is said that among President Reagan's favorite words from what amounts to our secular hymn are these: "My native country, thee, land of the noble free, and our fathers, God to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing." The hearse will carry the casket with the body of the President from Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland to the District of Columbia, where it will be transferred to the horse-drawn caisson. Caisson, a traditional piece of Army ground war equipment designed, for, among other things, to carry artillery into place. Perhaps this is as good a time as any to clear up what may be some confusion about the riderless horse, the symbolic riderless horse, with President Reagan's riding boots positioned backward in the stirrups. There will be a riderless horse in the procession this evening, as well as on Friday's procession. So if there's any confusion in your mind about that, know that there will be the symbolism of the riderless horse this evening and again on Friday. And the hearse begins to roll. Soon, the caisson will roll. We mentioned earlier the gentle advisory that for children to see this kind of event is, or has been in the past, for many Americans, a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. And that one of the things television does well, it does so many things not very well, one of the things television does well is take you there. And today, television can bring you wherever you are, you and the children, here to Washington to see this state funeral for President Ronald Reagan. Gathering here are the 4 still living former presidents of the United States. Former President Jimmy Carter, who's now 79. President George Bush, President Bush I, as his family calls him, turns 80 years old this coming Saturday. Former President Gerald Ford is now 90 years old. President Ford suffered a minor stroke in 2000, actually during the Republican National Convention, but he is gathering with the other three here. And of course, President Bill Clinton, who's now 57 years old. They'll be paying their respects in the Capitol Rotunda and attending the official formal funeral services on Friday in the Capitol Rotunda. As we watch the motorcade make its way from Andrews Air Force Base, we cut to a picture of the horse-drawn caisson on which the president's casket will be carried, and the procession marchers as they move into place. This gives us an opportunity to bring in Edmund Morris, distinguished author of The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, which won both the Pulitzer Prize and the American Book Award in 1980. Edmund Morris was commissioned by President Reagan to be President Reagan's official biographer, was given unprecedented access to the then president. The book Dutch, a memoir of Ronald Reagan. Welcome, Edmund Morris. Did President Reagan ever discuss with you in your long conversations with him what he wanted when he passed from this earth in way of a state funeral or recognition?
No, he didn't. He talked to me about his interment, his actual burial in California, and what he said to me might be more appropriate on Friday. He didn't like to talk about things like this too much. He was a very private person. But I was thinking as I was watching that casket being taken off the plane, back to 1993, was it, when Nixon died, and his casket was brought to Edwards Air Force Base in California, and I, by coincidence, watched that with Ronald Reagan. I was in his office in Los Angeles, heard that the casket was arriving. It was live on TV, so I rushed through to the TV room to watch this, and became aware of the fact that there was this long, brown, suited body slumped in an easy chair, watching the screen with the most intense absorption. It was Reagan, watching motionlessly as the casket was taken off. He was already beginning to be a bit strange with Alzheimer's. He had this enormous quietness about him. And after the casket was loaded and driven away, he said to me, "You know, I'm the oldest one left now." Of course, he was the oldest one before Nixon died, too.
He had it in his mind.
Yes. But the other thing that struck me was that he felt a member of this very small, exclusive club of presidents. They understand one another and are intensely interested in one another.
CBS News correspondent Bill Plant is at 16th and Constitution, where the casket will be transferred to the horse-drawn caisson. Bill?
Yeah, we can see the horses in the caisson just a little bit away from here, but we reached out to the crowd to ask Pat Ingolia of Sacramento, California, what got her here, and just overnight, right?
Just overnight. I left last night in Sacramento 10:30 from my home, took the midnight flight, and arrived here at 8:30, and now I'm here.
Well, you said you worked for Governor Reagan when he was running his first campaign for governor in California.
First campaign. I was a young adult, and I was part of the Reagan Revolution, and I was very proud to be part of that. And worked in his first campaign, went to Sacramento, and became part of the staff. And it's been very exciting to be part of his life, and so I'm here to be part of the celebration of his life.
But this was a sort of sudden decision, wasn't it?
Well, I've sort of had it in the back of my mind. When this moment came, I wanted to be part of his celebration of life. So.
But you're talking about it as a celebration. Explain.
Well, there is some sadness, but he has been, he has been ill for 10 years, and so now now it's time for him to really be at rest, and it's time for us to celebrate his wonderful, wonderful life and the dedication he gave to those of us, the Americans, and the citizens of America and the world. He was just truly a wonderful, wonderful leader for our country.
People turn out for something like this, I suppose, partly because it's history and partly because of a connection that they feel. And you?
Both, actually, because I feel he is a great part of our history, but I think, those of us who participated in his cause, it was a part of our life. It wasn't just Ronald Reagan out there. We were part of something together, and he made us feel a part of what he was doing. And so, I think that's how a lot of people feel.
Well, you said that you felt he was almost part of your family.
Right. My young son commented, just a few months ago that when Ronald Reagan, we were talking about Ronald Reagan, he says, he's been part of our life. I grew up with him in our household, Mom. He's just part of our family. So that's how I think many people feel.
And you've been standing out here since, what, noon?
11:30 noon. Yes, well, standing since I left last night. So it's been great. And I'm with friends, and I plan to spend a couple days here, and we'll meet some other folks that we've spent a lot of time together the past 40 years. So this is a great celebration.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you.
Bill Plant on Constitution Avenue at 16th Street, where the motorcade is awaited and where the transfer to the caisson, the horse-drawn caisson, will move from roughly 16th and Constitution on down to the Capitol. Bob Schieffer, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated and there was the state funeral for him, a never-to-be-forgotten sight for even any child of memory age. It was the first time that such a ritual in this country had been seen around the world.
Well,
now,
it was.
once again, the world looks in.
And it changed America. For one thing, up until that point, people depended mostly on newspapers for their news. After that, because everyone gathered around the television sets and saw this one event, which was the first time the nation had seen one event like that and shared it. From that day forward, television became the dominant media. It was a day that changed everything. And then that whole weekend, I was just thinking about this. The lines, Dan, once they put Kennedy's body in the Capitol, stretched sometimes 40 blocks. People waiting to get in and see Kennedy. And then, of course, when Lyndon Johnson, when his body lay in repose there, it went on late into the night. And I recall one of the nicest touches, it seemed to me, was that the president's daughters, Linda Robb and Lucy, both stood at the casket in the Rotunda and shook hands with all of the people who came passing by. And I remember after we went off the air, my wife and I went up and stood in line to go by and see the casket. And it was late in the night, and Linda and Lucy were still there to greet the people who came to see Lyndon Johnson's casket. It was quite a touching thing. It always is, and it will be again when we get to that point tomorrow.
Beautiful high shot there, and now back on the ground as there are ripples of applause for the various members of military services who move into their places for this solemn walking and horse-drawn procession to the Capitol. You're watching CBS News coverage of Ronald Reagan and the death of the president. We go now to CBS News correspondent Bob Orr, who's on Constitution Avenue, not at the same place as Bill Plant, just a little more toward the Capitol. Bob?
In fact, Dan, I am about a mile on down the procession route from where Bill is and about 3 blocks from the Capitol. And I have to say down here, the crowds are 4 and 5 deep. And that really is something when you consider the challenging conditions today. It's oppressively hot. The security is very difficult. These people are here and quite dedicated to be here. People like Les Stanberry, who's here from San Antonio. It would be easier to find a shady spot, I suppose, but why did you come, Les?
I came just to show my respects once in a lifetime opportunity that'll probably, hopefully my lifetime will never happen again. And it's just exciting to be here.
Did you come for any particular reason? What do you hope to see? Or is it more just an emotional thing, an attachment?
It's an emotional attachment, just to show my respect for the family, what President Reagan did for our country. And that's why I'm here.
You remember, of course, similar events when President Johnson was laid to rest, and of course, the procession with John Kennedy.
Yes.
You probably never thought you had a chance to be here in person.
Never thought that would happen again.
As you have spent time in the crowd, and you've spent more time there than I have, people seem very solemn, very somber.
Yes, they do.
What is the spirit you pick up down there?
The spirit is just an emotional, it's just, everybody's here to say we're showing our respect. And that's all I've heard everybody say.
One thing I haven't heard any talk of politics or any kind of partisanship. Does it strike you that way as well?
That's right. That's right. Even some of the police officers I'm talking to said, well, I'm Republican, I'm Democrat, but, you know, he was a great president.
Well, Les, thanks very much for spending a few minutes with us. Enjoy your visit here in Washington.
Thank you, Bob.
Very many people with similar stories. I've seen children, Dan, in the crowd with hand-lettered signs, veterans who have come with flags, and some people wearing old campaign lapel pins. Each has come for their own reason to pay their respects to President Ronald Reagan, and they've come on a very, very difficult and challenging day. Dan?
Bob Orr on Constitution Avenue. As one watches the members of the procession continue to move into place awaiting the arrival of the motorcade, the thought comes to mind that with the state funeral for President John F. Kennedy in 1963, the nation was in a state of shock because the president had been assassinated. And what we now refer to as the 4 dark days, beginning in Dallas on Friday and not ending, but to a certain degree, a period coming behind the 4 days with the state funeral on Monday. With the state funeral of President Lyndon F. Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in 1973, it was a case somewhat similar to this, in which the president had died of natural causes. Quite a bit of difference in terms of the national mood. As the gentleman with Bob Orr and the lady, I think it was, with Bill Plant pointed out, the word respect is what is the most common word mentioned here today, whereas with the state funeral for President Kennedy, I think the words shock and mourn were the 2 words most often used, not to suggest that there isn't mourning here, but it's a small point, difference in mood.
I don't think you can even compare the 2 days, because let's face it, I mean, we didn't know what had happened here. You'll remember, Dan, because you were in Dallas with me, they had closed off the borders with Mexico. When John Kennedy was shot, at one point we didn't know if this was the beginning of a war with the Soviet Union. The other part, we'd never gone through a traumatic event like this kind of tragedy. This was our first experience with something like this. Many things changed that day in Dallas. This is something Ronald Reagan has been, suffering from Alzheimer's for 10 years now. And Nancy Reagan has been going through what the relatives of many people who have parents or relatives with Alzheimer's, she's been going through this terrible battle for the last 10 years. But this is a much different kind of mood today, and I think you hit on the right word, respect. People liked Ronald Reagan. They're here to pay respects. But this is nothing like the day in Dallas in 1963.
Senator John McCain, hero of the Vietnam War and now United States Senator from Arizona, is up on Capitol Hill at the Russell Senate Office building. Senator McCain, thank you for being with us. When did you first meet Ronald Reagan?
When I came home from prison in 1973, as many know, the Reagans became very involved in the POW issue for a variety of reasons, including so many of the POWs were based out of ships that were from California, or air bases in California, and I got to know them at these parties, and Governor Reagan asked me to speak at his Prayer Day breakfast last year. He was a governor of California the following year, and then we kept up a relationship ever since.
True or untrue that President Reagan inspired your entry into politics?
Well, he certainly was a major factor, and not only the entry into politics, but a belief in in his vision for America and our strength and our greatness. There's not a lot of Americans that remember how in the 1970s this nation was certainly questioning itself and its future. It was divided over a war we'd lost, and a president that said we were suffering from a national malaise. And I admired very much President Reagan, then Governor Reagan's vision for America, our strength, our ability to win the Cold War, and our ability to be a shining city on a hill, is the phrase he made so famous.
Senator McCain, what do you think is Ronald Reagan's most lasting legacy?
Well, I think that's an easy one, Dan. As far as accomplishments are concerned, it's, as Margaret Thatcher said, winning the Cold War without firing a shot. Perhaps in a little more, less substantive fashion, the fact that he had this great belief and unshakable confidence about the greatness of America. The only other president that I know of that had this unshakable confidence and belief was Theodore Roosevelt, who had this vision of America's greatness and place in the world, and that's why those two really in many ways were similar.
Senator, certainly politics have changed since Ronald Reagan was first elected in 1980 and then re-elected in 1984. If you disagree, say so, but one obvious change is that politics in this country have become, I hesitate to use the word venomous, but certainly more hostile than they were during that time. Let's face it, we've had rough and tumble politics all of our history. Would you agree that since Ronald Reagan's presidency, things in political life have taken a turn for the worse, particularly when it comes to campaigns?
Oh, I would definitely say that. Look, these were rough issues back in those days. Tax cuts, aid to the Contras, the deployment of the cruise and Pershing missiles, the nuclear freeze. Look, they were very volatile and tough issues. But the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill epitomized what politics was, and that was strong partisanship, but friendship and a relationship which established a basis for doing business. In other words, there were a couple of times where national security issues were concerned, where Ronald Reagan had to call up Tip and say, look, we got to do this for the good of the country. And because of the relationship they had, then they were able to move forward. Look, my predecessor in the House, John Rhodes and O'Neill were friends. There was Barry Goldwater's good friend in the Senate was George McGovern. No, we don't have that anymore. We need to return to it. Americans are tired of the bitter partisanship which gridlocks us, and I hope that in our remembrance of Ronald Reagan, perhaps we can remember his affability, while at the same time he adhered strictly to and unwaveringly to his principles.
Senator John McCain, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Dan.
The air is heavy in Washington. It's a warm, yea, hot summer day on the mud flats of the Potomac. Thunderstorms threaten in the distance. Slight haze has come over Constitution Avenue as the arrival of the motorcade from Andrews is awaited. John Roberts is in Savannah, Georgia, with President Bush's role in these ceremonies for President Reagan. He has the story of that. John?
Well, Dan, the president has a couple of duties in terms of the death of a president. He is the one who is charged with informing the nation of the death of President Ronald Reagan, which he did over the weekend. President Bush himself learned about it late on Saturday afternoon. He was actually in bed in Paris when news came. As his wife Laura said, not asleep. He was up reading. His chief of staff came into the room and said, Mr. President, we have to inform you that President Ronald Reagan has died. So he then informed the nation on Friday he will deliver the eulogy. He's down in Sea Island, Georgia, hosting the G8, which is about 60 miles south of where we are in Savannah, Georgia. And he has been working on the speech literally since late Saturday night when he first got word of President Reagan's death. We're told that it will probably run about 10 to 12 minutes in length, and it will be a collection of memories from President Bush, his thoughts on President Reagan, as well as what he believes are some appropriate words for the nation. To give you something of an idea of what we may hear from the president yesterday when he was meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi, Mr. Bush said that Ronald Reagan will go down in history as a great American president because he had a core set of principles from which he would not deviate. He understood that a leader is a person who sets clear goals and makes decisions based upon principles that are etched in his soul, and our nation will miss him. You know, Dan, you've been mentioning with Bob Schieffer the funeral of President Kennedy in 1963, and I recall that that's one of the earliest memories of my life was watching the coverage of that. And certainly, you can say that no matter where you were or how old you were, that really affected you. It was, as you said, a shock to the nation, a real body blow. The tone here is completely different. Obviously, there is mourning for the 40th president. There is great sadness among the Reagan family and people who knew him. But this, Dan, I believe, is also a celebration of life and a celebration of the president's legacy. And really, what a legacy it is. President Reagan, in fact, has become more popular since he left office than he actually was in office. And whether some of that's being viewed through the misty lens of history or whether or not people are actually appreciating his policies, Dan, certainly this is a great moment for the country.
John Roberts reporting live from Savannah, Georgia, where he's covering the G8 economic summit where President Bush is presiding.
All right.
What a beautiful picture of hazy Constitution Avenue, with the crowds now approaching 4, 5, in some places 6 deep, awaiting the arrival of the motorcade, which is probably another 8 or 9 minutes away. At some point between 6 and 7 o'clock Eastern time tonight, sometime 40, 45 minutes from now at least, 21 aircrafts will fly over the funeral cortege just about the time it crosses 4th Street. 21 F-15s. Edmund Morris, biographer of Ronald Reagan, in brief and in general, what was the view of Ronald Reagan abroad when he came to the American presidency, and how did it change over the length of his presidency?
It was uncannily like the view of President Bush now. He was regarded as a cowboy of limited mental faculties from the wrong side of the country. Europeans are basically snobbish, as we all know. But it was perhaps, the attitude is perhaps best personified by Francois Mitterrand of France, who became president at the same time that Reagan did, in 1981. And at the Ottawa Economic Conference in the spring of 1981, after he talked to Reagan for a while, Mitterrand went to Trudeau and he said, "What planet does this man come from?" He spent the rest of the conference making jokes about Le Cowboy from the American West. But of all the speeches in honor of Reagan toward the end of his presidency, the most eloquent and the most admiring was that of Francois Mitterrand in 1988, who said, "I have come to realize that Ronald Reagan had la notion de l'État, he had the notion of the state. He embodied the state, the dignity of the American state, to an admirable degree, and he grew to admire him once he'd gotten beyond what Europeans call the corn barrier."
Once he got beyond what the Europeans call the corn barrier. Bob Schieffer, this story will not relate to everyone, but it's well known, the story of the man who comes into the pool hall, sort of says, "Well, which end of this stick do I use?" And then runs the table. There was in Ronald Reagan some of that. He benefited from lower expectations, which not always intending to do so, but he was not above sort of saying, "Well, which end of this cue stick do I use?" and then running the table.
And I suppose, and tell me if I'm wrong, that Margaret Thatcher would have been the first to understand that, what Dan has just said.
I think so. Reagan, you see, was not an intellectual. He was not particularly cultured. But people always think that intellectuals are intelligent, which is not necessarily the case. Reagan was a very intelligent man, and it took a while for sophisticated foreigners to realize this. He had superb instincts, and he had great analytical skills, which show up to extraordinary effect in his writings, and he's written diaries and letters.
How many more guys you need?
Mika Brzezinski is on the west front of the Capitol. Mika?
Good answer.
Dan, the procession will at some point culminate here at the west front entrance of the Capitol, and the horse-drawn caisson will pass right behind me on this walkway, and then will proceed to the base of the Capitol steps. Now, that's where the former president will then be carried by hand by 8-member casket-bearing teams, with one member of each branch of the military taking part. And they will climb the 75 steps on the outside and then 33 more on the inside up into the Rotunda with the casket holding the former president. It will be a solemn final climb for this president who took the same path for both of his inaugurations so many years ago. Now, after an extensive arrival ceremony that will include former presidents, dignitaries, and members of Congress, Nancy Reagan will enter the Rotunda and she will receive her husband's casket, the arrival of the casket, which will be placed atop a pine catafalque, which was actually built for Abraham Lincoln and has been used several times since. Now, there will be an official ceremony, of course, that we're going to cover live. And then after the ceremony at 9 o'clock tonight, Dan, the president will officially lie in state starting at 9 o'clock tonight. He will do so for 34 hours. And that's when some 5,000 mourners an hour will have a chance to pay their respects in person. And Dan, the first mourner arrived at 5 o'clock this morning. She's first in line.
Mika Brzezinski, thanks. Once the transfer of the casket is made from the motorcade to the horse-drawn caisson, the funeral cortege will move up Constitution Avenue from 16th and Constitution. It'll go about 1.5 miles on Constitution, past the Great Mall, past First Street, and on to the Capitol. We like to prepare you when we can for what you are going to see. Right now you're seeing a picture of the first elements of the motorcade passing over the bridge over the Potomac, leading to the place where the transfer to the caisson will be made. The caisson procession will include over 300 military service members. 18 vehicles will carry family members. The last time the caisson was deployed and these military elements were deployed for this kind of occasion was in 1973 for the state funeral of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Those kinds of signs are everywhere along the motorcade route here in Washington, as they were in California. We love you, Mr. President. Goodbye, Dutch. Thank you, Mr. President. Those kinds of sentiments expressed on signs held by children and adults. The caisson procession, we were preparing you for what you're going to see in not too many minutes from now. 6 matched horses pull the black artillery caisson carrying the flag-wrapped casket. 3 soldiers will guide the team astride on 3 of the horses. The riders will be dressed in the Army blue uniform with riding breeches and boots with spurs. But you've seen all the pictures of President Reagan. Loved to wear the riding boots, sometimes with spurs, sometimes not.
He always wrote English, you know, because he was in so many cowboy movies. People thought that he would probably ride a Western saddle, but he didn't. He rode an English saddle and wore the high riding boots and the jodhpurs and all of that. But he's a good rider. He was a very good rider.
And he wore a cowboy hat about as well as anybody ever worn it, short of maybe Tom Mix.
Shot with his left hand. Waved with his left hand.
Talking to his friend, he said they're coming over the bridge right now. So they're probably what?
Bill Plant can give details about the transfer of the casket to the caisson. Bill?
Then the caisson and the 3 pairs of horses, the 6 black horses, are just out of our camera range, a little bit off to there, waiting for the hearse to pull up. Ronald Reagan, who loved horses, as you've been observing, would appreciate these. These are beautiful animals. They're, we're told, a mixture of Percheron and quarter horse. Beautiful, powerful black horses. And they will pull that caisson, which, as I think we mentioned, used to be used in the old horse cavalry days for artillery, and also to hold the dead off the battlefield. What happens here, though, is that the hearse carrying Ronald Reagan's body and the cars carrying the family will come to a stop. And the pallbearers, who are gathered just across Constitution Avenue from where we are, will step forward, and they will take the casket out of the hearse and place it on the caisson, getting ready for that mile-and-a-half procession down Constitution Avenue to the Capitol. The military honor guard will be in place. There'll be military music, which will be part of this procession. And as you mentioned, the riders will only be on the left side of each pair of horses. We're told that that's because in the past, the other horse of each pair was used to carry equipment, supplies off the battlefield or to the battlefield. And then there will be a commander who rides separately ahead and to the left. The horse, the riderless horse, is another one of those black mixed breed Percheron quarter horses. It's called the cap horse or the caparison horse. It's from Fort McNair here, just across the river. It's called Sergeant York. And as you mentioned, Dan, Ronald Reagan's own boots will be reversed in the stirrups as that riderless horse precedes the caisson down Constitution Avenue. Reagan used to say to us more than once when he was in California that nothing felt quite so good as a ride on a horse. And we could see him from that telescopic lens we had mounted in the mountains, getting up every morning, getting out, saddling up. He did his own tack, and then riding off. Nancy Reagan always accompanied him, but you know what? She didn't really like to ride. She learned to ride because she wanted to be with him, and she was also a little concerned about the fact that he was a very accomplished rider, and even into his, well into his middle years, used to dismount by sliding off one side of the horse. Now, if any of you who've ever ridden know that that's not an easy thing to do. And we would see him do it day after day up there. And of course, his sense of humor never left him either. He used to joke to us about that long lens, which could see them. He'd say, you know, fellas, one of these days, I'm just tempted to look up at you and grab my chest and fall down. Now, he said, I know I can't do that. The boys wouldn't like it. But he knew we were up there watching him, and we could certainly see how much he enjoyed riding. Dan?
Bill, our viewers are now seeing a shot from the Capitol. Now it's moved off. That's a shot from the west side of the Capitol, looking over the Great Mall. One of the great scenes of the United States capital city, to stand at this place and look down across the reflecting pool. You can just barely see it in mid-picture. One of the most underestimated pieces of sculpture in the country, sculpture of former President Ulysses S. Grant on horseback. See it just in front of the reflecting pool. And then beyond that, the mall that stretches, the Washington Monument, farther in the distance, the Lincoln Memorial, and slightly off to the left of this view, the great Jefferson Memorial.
You know, Dan, Ronald Reagan was the first president, as you know, who was inaugurated on the west side of the Capitol. All the other inaugurations have been on the other side, the east side of the Capitol. But Reagan, coming from Hollywood with Mike Deaver, looked out and saw that scene and said, this is where we need to do this. And it also had the symbolic significance of he was looking west.
I want to pick up on that, Bob Schieffer, that his second inauguration was driven indoors by the snow. But right now, it's my duty to say that you are watching CBS News' continuing coverage of Ronald Reagan, the death of a president. And as we await the changeover, the casket from the motorcade to the horse-drawn caisson, we pick up on the point that in 1980, President Reagan won in what, by any reasonable analysis, can be called an electoral vote landslide over Jimmy Carter. We were talking earlier in the day, that was a close race until the last weekend. There was a shift, a clear shift in voters' minds over the weekend. The indication from the polls was that voters had decided they were not all that pleased with President Carter, but they hadn't yet decided that they were ready to move to Ronald Reagan. And the weekend before the Tuesday election, they made that shift. And by Monday, it was obvious that Reagan was going to be the winner. And by Tuesday, he had the electoral vote landslide. And after that is when he became the first president in our history to be inaugurated on the west front of the Capitol, as you pointed out. Man of the West took a look at that great scene in the west front and said, this is where I'll be inaugurated. He wanted to be inaugurated there, re-inaugurated, after his 49 states carrying giant earth slide of 1984, but as you recall, Bob Shiefer, it snowed.
Yes, I do. And those
of us, move it inside.
Those of us who were going to be outside that day reporting on it, we were very pleased when they moved it indoors, because it was bitterly cold here, and it was so cold they couldn't even have the parade. You'll remember they moved that out to an arena, an indoor arena where they let the bands play and so forth. But it was Nancy Reagan who said, this is just not going to work. It's too cold for everybody. And so they had the inauguration in the Capitol Rotunda, under the Rotunda.
If you're watching your stream closely, you can see some of the lead elements of the motorcade approaching the place on Constitution Avenue, the spot on Constitution Avenue, where the transfer of the casket will be made. Well, the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy in 1961 was marked by a bitter snowstorm. All other inaugurations after that came in at least reasonably good weather until Ronald Reagan's second inauguration in 1985, after the election of '84, when there was again a terrible snowstorm. It's no longer popular to say so, but in the presidency of, certainly, of John F. Kennedy, and to a degree during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, it, you know, the wags would say, well, Washington, D.C. always thinks of itself as a southern city. It has mostly a southern climate, but it has northern manners.
Southern charm and northern efficiency.
Good point, Edwin Morris.
Actually, no, it's the other way around, wasn't it?
Yes, it was southern efficiency and northern charm.
Right.
Bob Orr along Constitution Avenue. Tell us what you see and hear and feel there.
Well, Dan, I can certainly tell you that it's a southern city today. It really feels like it. Temperatures are around 90 degrees, and the humidity is somewhere about the same. Chance of thunderstorms, but people in the crowd have braved the elements to be here to pay their respects. There have been some problems, frankly, in the crowd with people being overcome by heat. The police and the fire department, they've done a good job of going up and down the rope lines, passing out water, passing out as fast as they could get it refilled. It's a very, very difficult day, but I think the people here, some of them who have waited since 10, 11 o'clock this morning, wouldn't miss it. They say the conditions aren't so challenging that they would miss the chance to pay their respects. As the procession moves here along Constitution towards the Capitol, when it gets right to about this point here will be one of the more dramatic and poignant moments of the afternoon and the evening. It's right overhead here where there'll be 21 Dan F-15s flying over, paying their respects to President Reagan. It will be quite a visual sight for people at home to see on television, and for the people here, obviously, and watch as one of those planes peels off in the famous missing man formation. If you've seen it before, and it's done from time to time, it is a very moving and poignant moment, and that will happen about 6:25 or so, Dan, right about here. Dan?
It's a steam bath on the streets of Washington. Hot, humid day. Slight rustle of the wind in the trees. The thunderstorms for the moment look like they may hold off for at least a couple of hours. You saw the casket whiz by in your picture there. And then the limousines carrying Nancy Reagan, members of the family, and other members of the official party. Edwin Morris, you said earlier that Europeans, particularly in the beginning, didn't consider Ronald Reagan a, quote, intellectual by their definition. One definition of being an intellectual is not necessarily being well-schooled, although Ronald Reagan was better educated than most people gave him credit for it. He had a college education because he went to a small school. I mean, but one definition of intellectualism is being curious. How curious did you find him?
Well, I did not find him a very curious man because we must remember he was old when he came to the presidency, and by then his lifelong curiosity about the world and its affairs was more or less slate. He had his philosophy firmly in place. So the president whom I talked to was a man who really felt he knew everything he needed to know. But I know that when he was young, he was insatiably curious about the world, and in fact was famous in Hollywood for being something of a bore, in the sense that he couldn't stop absorbing information and rehearsing it in front of everybody. They nicknamed him the teacher in the studio because of his compulsive interest in the affairs of the world.
The hearse bearing the casket of President Ronald Reagan has just turned on to Constitution Avenue. You can see that the wind has picked up just a bit as you see the flags unfurling in the breeze behind this motorcade. We said earlier today in our coverage, and we say again now, that for Americans of a certain age, what we sometimes used to call the age of innocence ended, being summed up in that photograph of the toddler in the baby blue suit saluting his fallen father, a young John Kennedy saluting his father in 1963. And we had the state funeral for President Kennedy. So far in the coverage of the state funeral this week of President Reagan, the picture that is burned into one's mind and will not leave is of Nancy Reagan in that small room at the Reagan Library just before they were to move the casket out, putting her head, her cheek, on the flag above the casket and giving a gentle kiss. The hearse has arrived with the south portico of the White House, south lawn of the White House in the distance, and the clomp of the horses' hooves in the foreground.
And don't you think, Dan, one reason that that picture was so poignant and had such an impact on all of us, it was not that we all understood losing a husband or losing a wife and how terrible that can be, but that, like so many people in this country who have had relatives who have had Alzheimer's disease, this terrible, cruel disease, and she has been dealing with that for 10 years now. And I think that's one reason that people did tend to identify so much with her.
It's a double bereavement, isn't it? She lost him in his soul, in his character, many years ago. Now she's losing his body. So it's a double bereavement, and one can't help understanding her agony.
We go to Bill Plant on Constitution Avenue.
Then, as you can see, the caisson has pulled up just ahead of the hearse. The honor guard standing at attention, and the First Lady, former First Lady Nancy Reagan, will be escorted out to watch the transfer of her husband's casket from the hearse to the caisson. The pallbearers, all of whom were people close to Ronald Reagan in life, will put the casket on the caisson. They include Michael Deaver, his longtime aide in California, then Deputy Chief of Staff here in Washington, his personal physician and White House physician, Dr. John Hutton, Charles Wick, an old show business friend who became the director of the USIA, Fred Ryan, a member of his administration, who's now at the head of the Reagan Foundation. The hearse door has opened, and we now hear the applause for First Lady Nancy Reagan, who approaches on the arm of an Army officer, acknowledging the crowd. She's smiling and she's waving. She seems strong, Ben. Tremendous applause for Nancy Reagan, which she acknowledges warmly and with a bit of a smile. Dan?
Bill Plant, thanks.
Forward. Left wheel. Whoop. Forward. Whoop. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Wait, nah, that's somebody else.
And the caisson rose. First Lady's hand could barely be seen through the window of a limousine carrying her, waving to the crowds. horse in the background, skittish, perhaps spooked a bit by the crowds on either side of the street. Ripples of applause. The men who have them doff their hats and caps. Many, if not most, placing over their hearts. Ronald Reagan rode to the pinnacle of American politics and world leadership on Constitution Avenue, and now rides to his funeral on this great wide avenue.
I'm about in. I'm done.
This scene from the west front of the Capitol, where President Reagan was sworn in for his first term as president in 1981. Bob Schieffer, we saw as they were getting the riderless horse in place and preparing this procession. It's now out of view, but there, in the deep background, was the south lawn of the White House, the south portico of the White House, including the Truman balcony. And out on that Truman balcony, how many nights did President Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan sit out on that balcony, that porch?
He used to love to stand on that porch and look directly out with his after-dinner cup of decaf and look at Thomas Jefferson under the cupola of the Jefferson Memorial directly opposite.
Joyce.
And he felt that Jefferson was looking back at him.
But you know, the great difference, Dan, is that's about as close as you can get to the White House anymore. Because when Ronald Reagan was here, in those days, you could drive along Pennsylvania Avenue, drive right, you know, and see the White House there. But now all of that has been changed because of the security considerations, and literally from where you saw on Constitution Avenue is about as close as you can get, at least in a car, to see the White House. I just think as I watched this parade, watched this funeral procession going down Constitution Avenue, how different Washington is from the days when you were covering the White House, when I was here. You'll remember, Dan, in those days, the only building in Washington you needed a security pass to get into was the White House in the old Executive Office building. In all the years I covered the Pentagon, back in those days, I didn't even have a press pass. And yet today, we have Pennsylvania Avenue barricaded off. We have the Capitol barricaded off. We have security cameras at all the national monuments. We're holding a funeral here for the man who had a great deal to do with breaking down and breaking back with the Soviet Union, our longtime enemy. But we're doing it under conditions imposed by the new enemy, these international terrorists.
This day is so hot and the wait has been so long, we hear that several military men have fainted. Bob Orr is on the cortege route. Bob?
In fact, Dan, just in front of our position here at 4th and Constitution, just a few moments ago, one of the Navy officers who was here standing duty along with all of his comrades along the line of Constitution fainted. They had to bring in emergency crews to help him. They've been busy passing out water. But the crowd, remarkably, has stood as one. There's not a lot of milling around. People are paying rapt attention. There is silence. It's a strange silence. People really are here, each with their own individual reason, some carrying signs across the way. There's a sign that simply says, thank you. Another poster featuring the actor Ronald Reagan, who said, when character was king. It's a difficult day, to be sure. Emotionally, it's difficult for people. The heat is oppressive. The security is as tight as I've seen it since 9/11. But the crowd seems to be quite solemn and quite attentive. And as the vanguard of the procession now just makes its way to the turn where Constitution just turns briefly, joins Pennsylvania for about 3 blocks on up to the Capitol, these people who have been here now for 5 to 6 hours are seeing what they came to see. Dan?
Soon, sometime during this hour, the 21 aircraft flyover will occur. It's scheduled to happen just about when the cortege crosses 4th Street. It'll be 21 F-15s. They'll be flying out of, not the blue, but out of the wild gray yonder on this thunderstorm-threatening evening. Edmund Morris, historian, biographer of Ronald Reagan. When a nation has this kind of ritual, this kind of spectacular, put that in perspective for us of what it means to the nation, to a people, to a society, and what does it tell us about a country, our own country, when we see these sights and hear these sounds.
Well, it tells us that we are an epic nation and that something epic has just happened. A legendary life has come to a conclusion. But only a president of really massive historical size can be buried in this fashion without us feeling that it's somehow overblown. But Reagan, as Mitterrand said, having this dignity of this state, of the state embodied in him, the way he behaved and the way he ruled, it seems entirely appropriate that his life, his long life, comes to conclusion with all this pageantry, with the irony that he himself, amidst pageantry, was always the most simple of men and not remotely interested in monuments.
In addition to being a historian, you're a teacher. For a child who's watching this, you would say the importance of it is?
For a child, I would say the importance of it is that it illustrates that one man can change the landscape of his country, can overnight revive its flagging spirits, and be remembered with gratitude when eventually he moves on. We feel bad about many of the recent happenings in the United States, and at a time like this when we're not feeling particularly good about ourselves, it's therapeutic to look back at a time when there was a president who made us feel terrific for the first time in many years.
Bob Schieffer, you've lived in Washington all these many years. The mood of this city over the last few days has been solemn, respectful. What have people been talking about in terms of the Ronald Reagan funeral?
You know, Dan, I think people see this as something of a respite. We've been involved in this fairly nasty political campaign. Most of the news lately has been bad from Iraq. It's just been a bad couple of weeks here, and I think people are relieved to have this opportunity to just sort of step back, think about something pleasant, think about a man who was an optimist, a man that many people saw in him. They saw what they thought was good about themselves, and that was an optimism. I think Washington, I think enjoy is the wrong kind of word to use for this, but I think it is a time when people are taking a break, and perhaps it's a time for reflection. You haven't heard many people, Dan, over the last couple of days talk about Reagan's policies. People haven't been arguing about was this policy right or that policy right or wrong. They've been arguing, they've been thinking about Ronald Reagan the person. And you can't think about Ronald Reagan without a little bit of a smile coming to your face, because he was funny, he was a good spirit, he enjoyed being here. The White House was not a prison for Ronald Reagan. He enjoyed being here, and I think he enjoyed being president. I think he enjoyed being Ronald Reagan when you come down to it.
Well, perhaps one of the reasons is that Ronald Reagan, in more ways than one, in many ways, beat the odds. What are the odds that you could be born in the circumstances into which he was born, Illinois, make his way up to become not only a Hollywood movie star, but President of the United States of America and leader of the free world? And here in death, at least so far, he has beaten the odds in this regard. But unlike what Mark Antony said at the funeral of Julius Caesar, that, in a paraphrase, the bad that men do often lives after them and the good is interred with their bones. With Ronald Reagan, the good is living after him. And whatever mistakes he made or flaws, stand a pretty good chance of being interred with his bones. You don't hear anybody, as you said, criticizing Ronald Reagan much. There'll be time for that later, a historical perspective for him. But now is not the time, but it is a time to say, listen, he had a great time being president. He didn't see it as the burden of the presidency. He saw it as the joy and the responsibility of the presidency. Where he was unlucky, of course, was the last 10 years of his life.
Yeah.
To go deeper and deeper into the dark shadows of Alzheimer's disease.
But you know, things like, for example, the Kennedy Center honors. Ronald Reagan loved to go to the Kennedy Center and see his friends from Hollywood come and be honored. Ronald Reagan loved St. Patrick's Day and trading Irish jokes with Tip O'Neill. He enjoyed the presidency, I think, as much as any man that I've seen in the White House.
That shot you just saw was of the Capitol Rotunda to where the casket is being taken in this slow procession, this cortege, moving up Constitution Avenue. There'll be private services here a little later, and then it'll be open to the public.
I once asked him in the Oval Office after one of those Kennedy Center evenings when he'd seen Charlton Heston, his good friend, acting up a storm the night before. I said, Mr. President, do you ever have any lingering nostalgia for the stage? I mean, would you like to go back to the stage when you leave the Oval Office? He said, no, why should I? I have the biggest stage in the world right here.
Great shot of the Capitol Dome in the direction of which the procession moves. The limousines roll and the bands play. Mika Brzezinski is on the west side of the Capitol. Mika?
Dan, I can hear the procession coming my way. This is the final leg of the former president's journey on this day, where it will end in the rotunda of the Capitol. And the casket, of course, accompanied by the honor guard, will be carried up the 75 steps of the Capitol behind me, and then the 33 more steps inside. It will be brought into the rotunda. And also there's some late information about how this ceremony will take place. The First Lady, Nancy Reagan, will also enter the same entrance that the president's casket will be brought in, and she will be accompanied by Vice President Cheney. And at some point during the ceremony tonight, she will be approaching the casket for another farewell to her husband. This is really, in many ways, where it all began for Ronald Reagan so many years ago. It's a moment to remember as his body is brought up these steps by members of the military. He came here for his inauguration back in 1981, his second inauguration 4 years later, in the Rotunda due to weather. He came here for 7 State of the Union addresses. And at times, he came here to fight for his ideals as to how this government should be run. As you can see, the honor guard is getting into place behind me. They will be accompanying the president's casket as it makes its way up the steps of the Capitol. The president, of course, now coming here once again to say goodbye. And members of the Senate and the House are gathered on the other side of the Capitol, hundreds of them, just to get a glimpse of what's happening here today, to watch history as it unfolds before their eyes, and in many ways to say goodbye to somebody who was important to them in many different ways, personally, politically, and maybe even as a grandfatherly symbol at this point as well. The love for Ronald Reagan can be seen through the streets of Washington on this day, and also in the orderly way this funeral is being carried out. These are not easy conditions, as Bob Schieffer pointed out earlier. It is sweltering hot, and there are security threats. There have been issues throughout the day, and people have handled them with great respect and great dignity, and just a common goal to be here to see what's happening with the passing of a president and the final goodbye here at the Capitol for Ronald Reagan. Of course, there's going to be a ceremony inside the Rotunda tonight. That's where the honor guard is headed, and dignitaries, former presidents, members of the House and the Senate will attend that ceremony. It will last within an hour. But then tonight, Ronald Reagan will say goodbye to America here in Washington. At 9 o'clock Eastern Time, the former president will officially lie in state for 34 hours. And thousands of mourners are already in line, hoping for a chance to walk by his casket and to say goodbye in person. Dan, back to you.
Mika Brzezinski. We mentioned earlier on in our coverage that a number of presidents have had their state funerals here in Washington, and those funerals have included lying in state here in the Capitol. That doesn't mean, because it isn't true, that they were in the Capitol Rotunda. President Lincoln, for example, did not lie in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Lincoln's remains went to the White House for display before his body was transported back to Illinois. President Kennedy's body, after his assassination, was put in the Capitol Rotunda. That of Lyndon B. Johnson in 1973 also, as we mentioned earlier, the casket was put in the Rotunda before President Johnson took the long ride back to Texas for his burial. As Mika Brzezinski mentioned, the body will lie in state in the Rotunda until Friday morning to be viewed by the public. Friday morning it'll be moved to the National Cathedral for the formal funeral services just before the casket is taken back out to Andrews Air Force Base and transported on its final journey to the site overlooking the Pacific at the Reagan Library, where President Reagan will be buried, next to a spot held for First Lady Nancy Reagan. The precise spot picked out by the Reagans. Every detail of this state funeral was approved by one or both of the Reagans, and the general outline for what they wanted and when they wanted it, such things as hymns, was specifically stated by the Reagans. They started planning this more than a decade ago.
I'm told, Dan, that's one of the more sobering parts of being president, is when they come to you and say, Mr. President, it's time to start thinking about that funeral, and how do you want to do it? I've had other presidents down through the years say that it gives you a little jar when they first bring it up, but it's something that everybody has to do.
The muffled drums in the background as you look up at the Capitol, they've now neared that spot on Constitution Avenue approaching the Capitol where the statue of former President and victorious Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant looks down on horseback. Just passing the Grant statue. As we listen to the muffled drums and the call of a cadence for the military escorting the caisson to the Capitol, you may have found yourself asking, perhaps children in the house have asked, well, why the Capitol Rotunda? Why put the casket there? Well, for one thing, it is considered to be the symbolic and physical heart of the U.S. Capitol building. And of course, the Capitol itself, known as the House of the People. Symbolically, that is why so often for state funerals, not just those of presidents, but national funerals of others, such as Alexander Hamilton and Dr. Martin Luther King, that their bodies are brought to the Capitol Rotunda so the people can pay their respects there in the people's house.
At one point, Dan, you'll remember that there was a move to have George Washington buried there. When they first began to think about it, they were going to bury him below the rotunda where Reagan's casket will be. And at one point, the plan was there would be a hole in the middle of the rotunda floor there where you could look down into the crypt, which is below the Capitol Rotunda, and see Washington's burial place there. And then they decided not to. Washington, of course, was buried at Mount Vernon. But it is a magnificent room, one of the most beautiful rooms, I guess, in the world, in any building. 90 feet across, 180-something feet high. Beneath that enormous painting in the dome.
The tradition of having a horse-drawn caisson started with the state funeral of President Abraham Lincoln. The riderless horse with the boots turned backward came later, and as I understand it, Edmund must help me with this, that it came from Europe, where the riderless horse was fairly common in European states as a symbol of a deceased leader. And it was brought to this country in the latter half of the 19th century. And when I say it was popularized, it was used during the state funeral of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy. And it has been, not often, but occasionally since that time.
It's peculiarly appropriate in this case because Reagan always was a man symbolically and in his own mind on horseback. I often got the feeling in the White House when he seemed to be bored by endless meetings that he was mentally in the Santa Barbara Mountains astride a horse. And that line he frequently came up with, there's nothing that makes a man feel so good inside as the outside of a horse. It was an epigram he stole from Goethe, but he repeated it with great conviction throughout his career.
Now the aircraft fly over. The aerial thunder of 21 F-15s echoes in the distance now as the funeral cortege reaches the first faint edge of the Capitol grounds themselves. Representatives of Congress awaiting the arrival of the funeral procession and to help escort it to the Rotunda. The Rotunda, to where the casket will be taken, is an imposing circular room that connects the House and Senate sides of the Capitol building. With the storied riderless horse symbolizing the fallen president, Ronald Reagan's casket has passed most of the crowd of thousands as they stood quiet witness to this high pageantry. And inside the Capitol, members of Congress await arrival of the casket. But outside, the cortege is not quite yet done. The drums have stopped sounding for the moment to mark the cadence of the marchers. The cheers, and there have been many, have subsided for the moment. Mrs. Reagan has waved repeatedly through the shaded glass of the limousine carrying her behind the horse-drawn caisson carrying the casket and the riderless horse. The former First Lady looking a bit wan, but at the same time still strong as she came off Air Force One earlier and has gone through this very long day, keeping in mind that it began in California early this morning. Perhaps you were here with us and heard it, that a man cried out very clearly just before the procession began to move from its first spot on Constitution Avenue, "God bless you, Nancy." In California, more than 100,000 people paid their respects to President Reagan in his presidential Hilltop Library. Many more thousands, I think it's fair to say, other tens of thousands will be viewing his casket in the Rotunda once it arrives there. One of those on the parade route today, identified as Carol Williams of Chesterfield, Virginia, looked around, and from her perspective, all the fanfare was for what she called a common man. She said, speaking of the Reagans, they didn't live in Camelot. They lived in reality with the rest of us. Outside the Capitol, and now in the last stages of the procession itself. The Capitol, of course, was burned by the British in 1814 during the War of 1812. So as part of the rebuilding of the Capitol, the Rotunda was not completed until 1824. This is going to take a little while longer for the cortege to make its way up to that place on the Capitol grounds where the casket will be taken off of the caisson and taken inside this magnificent structure that is the Capitol, inside to the Rotunda.
What lady said about the Reagans not living in Camelot was true enough. Yeah. However, he was a wealthy man, and for much of his life he lived in surroundings of great luxury. But the one interior he did design around himself was his ranch above Santa Barbara in the mountains. A cabin of the most extraordinary simplicity, with awkward oil paintings of horses hanging at crooked angles and fake towers on the floor that he laid himself, and fly paper outside with dead flies hanging off it. And to him, that was paradise.
One mark of just how good a politician he was, just how good a leader he was, that as you point out, well, neither he nor Nancy Reagan lived, quote, in Camelot, as the lady along the podium said. They did live in wealth. They had earned. But to be able to be that wealthy, to live in wealth, and to still be known as a champion of, quote, the common man, as the Reagans were with this woman and many others, not to say everyone in the country, no small accomplishment for a leader to be able to do that.
Yes, it's the kind of thing you can't fake. There have been many laborious attempts by many of our presidents to seem like men of the people when they were palpably not. But Reagan genuinely was a very commonplace person in his personality and in his private life, and never took on any false graces. Even though he was such a dignified man in office, he comported himself identically whether he was talking to taxi drivers or whether he was talking to heads of state. He's a genuine Democrat in that sense.
Well, President Reagan is returning in death now to a Congress that in life he just absolutely loved to scold and use as a foil. Once he said, that big white dome bulging with new tax revenues. Tax and spin crowd, he called the inhabitants of the Capitol when he was president and fighting his political battles. He also said, I have wondered at times what the 10 Commandments would have looked like if Moses had run them through the U.S. Congress.
Talking about the houses he lived in, you know, throughout his life he had a dream of a White House that he would one day inhabit. Right from teenage years, he dreamed of this house with tall white columns and tall windows, which was, in his words, to let or for rent. He said, I used to have that dream repeatedly until I came to this place and moved in here, and, you know, I've never had that dream since.
You know, Dan, I have had people tell me who worked in the White House, you're talking about he always, you know, he was the same with a cab driver as he was with a head of state in many ways. They said you always knew Reagan was coming because you could hear people in the halls laughing. When he'd come to work in the White House, he'd come down the hall, he'd always have a word for the guards standing there. He'd have a little joke or a quip. And they said we knew he was on the way. When we'd hear people laughing in the hallways. And I think that was part of it when you talk about. I think he had, in a sense, an actor's appreciation of the audience in some ways. He knew how to connect. He was always proud of his acting background. He felt that it helped him to communicate and to persuade. He wanted, Mike Deaver told me one time, he didn't like the lights to be down when he was making a speech. He wanted the lights to be up because he wanted to see the people and he wanted to connect with them. He did enjoy being with people.
Whenever he came into a room, he would always flick his eyes around looking for the camera. He had to know where it was before he could function.
The procession is now, as you can see, right at the steps of the Capitol. It's near where our CBS News correspondent Mika Brzezinski is posted. Mika?
Dan, the casket just passed before me, followed by the riderless horse, the symbol of a fallen leader. And as we have been watching and planning, there will be a transfer now of this casket into the arms of 8-member teams of the military. And each member will be a representative of a branch of the military, and they will carry that casket up the steps. And you look at this beautiful procession and the colors and the shining instruments and the respectful soldiers and the hundreds of thousands of people who have come here to watch this history take place before their eyes, people who want to say goodbye one more time. It's hard to imagine there were naysayers so many years ago who said that Ronald Reagan wasn't fit to be president. He was too old. He was just an actor. And you think of the many ways that he impacted this country, and now this tremendous outpouring of support, people who want to be here to say goodbye, and this beautiful beginning of his funeral and his goodbye here in Washington. This will be a very, very, very beautiful image to see as the former president's casket will now be transferred into the arms of the military and slowly taken up 75 steps outside the west front entrance of the Capitol, where he was inaugurated in 1981, facing west because he chose to do so for various reasons. Then he'll be carried 33 more steps up, 2 more flights of stairs into the Rotunda, where he will be greeted by his wife, Nancy Reagan, will greet his casket for a service to take place inside the Rotunda this evening. Dan, so many people have been waiting here, some since 5 this morning, to not only watch this unfold, but to be here tonight when the president lies in state and is open to the public. Back to you.
No, one of the things that with this oppressive heat, which is about the only way to properly describe it, and threatening thunderstorms, although the breeze has picked up, giving some relief in the last hour and a half, been no sign of the dreaded cicadas. You know, it was 17, 18 years ago, President Reagan compared Democratic lawmakers to the, quote, screeching periodic cicadas that at that time, and then again this spring, had infested the city. But those battles are all gone with the wind today. This is a tribute that draws together Republicans and who idolized President Reagan and many Democrats who liked him even while they abhorred, I think that's the proper verb, some of his policies. The Senate voted 98-0 to pass a resolution documenting President Reagan's achievements. A House resolution passed 375 to zip, saying that President Reagan championed freedom and democracy throughout the world. He probably never thought, Bob Schieffer, that he'd ever get those kinds of votes from any Congress.
It's a good vote. And we had the cicadas, Dan, last week, but then we had a little cold snap here, and they sort of went away. But it was 17 years ago, 1987, when we had this just hordes of cicadas. You couldn't hear yourself think, they get so loud. But apparently they have gone away again to do whatever they do for 17 years.
The riderless horse now taken off to the side. He's been skittish throughout this afternoon. Now, Edmund Morris, the biographer of President Reagan, who's with us here this afternoon, mentioned earlier that President Reagan, perhaps partly, if not mostly, because he came to the presidency at an advanced age, the oldest man ever elected to the presidency, that he pretty much knew what he believed. Not pretty much, he did. And President Reagan himself said at the end of his second term, and I quote him, "I am the same man I was when I came to Washington. I believe the same things I believed when I came to Washington, and I think those beliefs have been vindicated by the success of the policies to which we hold fast," unquote.
He was essentially the same man in 1981 that he was in 1924, 25, when he was a young high school and college student. And he wrote short stories and essays in which the hero was invariably a figure very much like himself. And some of these essays which survive are almost uncanny in their prefiguring of the figure that he symbolized as President of the United States.
Bill Plant, our veteran CBS News correspondent who covered much of the rise of Ronald Reagan on the national political scene and then was our CBS News White House correspondent during the Reagan years, and he's still our White House correspondent, has been with us during the afternoon. Bill, when Ronald Reagan first was elected governor of California, you saw some flashes, not often, but occasionally, of temper. I don't remember seeing any. Perhaps there was some in private. Certainly none in public
Dan,
after he became president.
They were very, very rare. Well, one of the few I remember was during a summit meeting when he was visibly annoyed with French President Mitterrand. Another one was before he became president, during the debate in New Hampshire, when he famously uttered the line, "I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green." The fellow's name was Breen, but that's all right, and had his say. But he didn't let his temper show in public. He was a very easygoing, genial fellow. At the same time, though, he had a detachment, which was fascinating to watch. He acknowledged people. They felt that he was paying attention to them, but at some level, he didn't connect. He was always just a bit remote, unless, of course, you were with him one-on-one, in which case he did connect.
Well, speaking of connecting, that again, Edmund Morris touched on this earlier, that he prided himself on his ability to connect with audiences. And we know that actors worry about what they call getting through the glass, which is sometimes stage actors just couldn't connect with the audience, and they saw it in their mind as a kind of glass they couldn't get through. And certainly we know in television it's sometimes hard to get through the glass and connect. But practiced as he was, and a great deal of it, his natural ability, Ronald Reagan never had difficulty getting through the glass.
Glass is exactly the right word. He had a strange habit of using one contact lens when he read his speeches and leaving the other one out, because he liked to maintain crowd contact with the unfocused eye and focus with the glass on the text.
It was, Dan, he understood so much about communication. That was, to me, the secret of his success. He walked like a president. He stood like a president. He had the posture of a president. And he understood that was part of communicating with the American people. And he understood that his posture relayed and somehow connected with people and helped them understand the respect that he had for the office of the presidency and for the job.
Members of the Reagan family have taken their places now in the Rotunda. Ronald P. Reagan, the son, on the right, flanked on his right. By the daughters, his sisters. And outside, the military prepares to move the casket.
Military ceremony was of extreme importance to him. He loved snapping those salutes. And the only piece of advice he ever gave to George H.W. Bush was, George, do a lot of saluting.
We're talking about the many things that President Reagan enjoyed while he was president, and he did live a presidency of joy for the most part. Bob Schieffer, he never seemed to enjoy these trips to Capitol Hill. He didn't take many of them, and when he did, he smiled, but you had a feeling that it wasn't his best smile when he was up here.
He came, he delivered the speeches when he'd make the State of the Union speech, and nobody could do a speech on television better than Ronald Reagan could. He understood he was basically talking to the people out there sitting in their living rooms. He understood what Franklin Roosevelt understood about radio. He was talking to a family sitting around the kitchen table or sitting around the television set at home. And I think sometimes the Congress didn't always enjoy that because they knew what he was doing, and they like to feel like, you know, they're at least part of the center of attention. But Reagan literally went over their heads. The Capitol was not his place. The White House was Ronald Reagan's place, I think.
This slight delay, it's actually, this whole ceremony for the day is run pretty much on schedule. But what we may be experiencing now is a slight wait for former First Lady Nancy Reagan to be escorted to the Rotunda by Vice President Dick Cheney. Vice President Cheney will eventually take the escort duties from the commanding general of the military district, the District of Columbia, on whose arm Nancy Reagan is now still. I say still because she was in California before they came to Washington today. Then she was as they came out of Andrews Air Force Base, and the general is escorting her into a side entrance of the Capitol, where Vice President Cheney will greet her and then become her escort. At least that is the plan. Nancy Reagan, despite this unquestionably tiring, wearing day, moving sprightly, moving well and strong. Mrs. Reagan will be staying tonight in Blair House, directly across the street from the White House, where foreign dignitaries and others here on official visits and otherwise are frequently put up for a night or longer. As the casket passed on its way to the Rotunda, Nancy Reagan reached out and touched it as it passed her by. The honor cordon has ended at the top of the Senate steps. Mrs. Reagan has been escorted by Major General Galen B. Jackman, Military District of Washington Commanding General, Vice President Dick Cheney will help preside inside the Rotunda itself. The order of procession is national colors, the clergy, the casket team, 8 body bearers, followed by 1 officer in charge. The casket weighs 700 pounds. It takes 3 teams of body bearers to transport it from the West Terraces into this Rotunda. Looking on, members of the House and Senate. Also looking on are the busts of Presidents George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, Ulysses S. Grant, Andrew Jackson, and Thomas Jefferson. Also looking down on the casket, the busts of Alexander Hamilton and Martin Luther King, among many that ring this Rotunda. In Great Britain, Buckingham Palace has announced that Prince Charles and Prime Minister Tony Blair will attend the funeral on Friday. As will all 4 still living former presidents of the United States, President Ford, Carter, Bush Sr., and Bill Clinton.
I believe his good friend Maggie Thatcher will be there too.
For the funeral on Friday. And perhaps before, we can't say for sure. Participants in the Capitol ceremony will be led by Vice President Dick Cheney, House Speaker Dennis Hastert, Republican of Illinois, Senator Ted Stevens, Republican of Alaska, the Senate President Pro Tem, the House Chaplain Daniel Coughlin, and Senate Chaplain Barry Black. day's proceedings, now running 25 minutes or so behind schedule, partly because it is slowed down quite a bit with the arrival of the casket at the Capitol steps. The slow, methodical, yes, difficult procedure of getting it here into the Rotunda. The moving of the colors indicates the casket is near now. If you found yourself asking why Cheney, Hassert, and Stevens, Bob Schieffer points out that they are the constitutional officers of the Congress, as laid out in the Constitution.
Yes, also the presidential line of succession. You won't see the Senate Majority Leader or the Minority Leader because they're not mentioned in the Constitution. And that's why they'll be the ones speaking tonight. These are all Republicans. When we had Lyndon Johnson's funeral, this Congress was controlled by the Democrats, and all the speakers at that funeral were Democrats.
President Reagan's casket will rest on the simple catafalque that was first used for Abraham Lincoln's funeral. The catafalque is made of rough pine boards, nailed together, covered with black cloth. The catafalque is stored below the Capitol crypt in a small chamber called Washington's tomb. Washington's tomb, the original intended burial place for the president, was never used. As Bob Schieffer pointed out, after thinking it through, they thought it might be
Let us pray.
Too imperial for President Washington, who was so determined not to have
The poet T.S. Eliot
imperial
wrote,
treatments.
"Neither does the actor suffer, nor the patient act, but both are fixed in an eternal patience, an eternal act. And the wheel turns. The wheel turns and is forever still. Ronald Wilson Reagan had many roles to play in life: husband, father, governor. But the most notable role on the world stage was that of the 40th President of the United States of America. With his style and grace, he made it seem easy. With his compassion and sense of timing, he brought strength of character to the nation and enkindled hope in a darkened world. As the patient, he brought humility to greatness and presided over embracing life to its natural end and dying with dignity, surrounded by love. To you, O Lord, ever patient with all of us, ever active in all of us, be praise and thanks for the life and impact Ronald Reagan has had upon us all. Support with your grace the Reagan family, and especially Mrs. Nancy Reagan, who stood by him in memorable moments of history and never left him in the long moments of difficult performance when the wheel turned all so slowly. Inspired by President Reagan, empower all of us, Lord, to employ our part in crumbling the walls of separation and in opening the gates to a globalized world. May our stillness here help us to remain faithful and patient with those suffering, and to make decisions that will renew faith in the future. All-powerful God, fix America in your eternal patience, in your eternal act, as the wheel turns, now and forever. Amen.
Mrs. Reagan, Patty, Ron, Michael, distinguished guests, members of the Reagan family, and friends of Ronald Reagan in America and throughout the world. Tonight, President Ronald Reagan has returned to the People's House to be honored by millions of Americans who loved him. Since 1824, under this rotunda, our nation has paid final tribute to many dedicated public servants. President Abraham Lincoln was the first president to lie in state under this Capitol dome. In the coming days, thousands will come to these hallowed halls to say goodbye to another son of Illinois who, like Lincoln, appealed to our best hopes, not our worst fears. In the life of any nation, few men forever alter the course of history. Ronald Reagan was one of those men. He rose from a young boy who didn't have much to a man who had it all, including the love of a faithful partner and friend he found in his wife, Nancy. The true measure of any man is what he does with the opportunities life offers. By that standard, Ronald Reagan was one of America's greatest. He first proved that as governor of California and later as president of the United States. When Ronald Reagan was sworn in as our 40th president, this nation was gripped by a powerful malaise. Inflation and unemployment were soaring, and the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War. By the time President Reagan left office, he had reversed the trend of ever-increasing government control over our lives, restored our defense capabilities, guided us through the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and set in motion policies which ultimately led to the collapse of the evil empire. His integrity, vision, and commitment were respected by all. But history's final judgment, I believe, will remember most his ability to inspire us. President Reagan put it best when he said, "The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one that gets the people to do the greatest things." This president inspired Americans by reaching out far beyond what he could attain. Like a good coach, he understood the value of a goal isn't always in achieving it. Sometimes it's enough to simply look out into the future and remind people what is possible. And often, President Reagan achieved the impossible. He reminded us that government is not the solution. The solution lies in each of us. True American heroes are ordinary people who live their lives with extraordinary character and strength. President Reagan showed us freedom was not just a slogan. He actually brought freedom to hundreds of thousands of people around this globe by opposing oppressive regimes. Those of us from the World War II generation looked up to him for his moral courage. In him, we saw leadership of great men like Eisenhower, who led the way and moved us to follow. On a wintry day in 1981, Ronald Reagan stood on the steps that lie just behind these doors to deliver his first inaugural address. He spoke of a journal written by a young American who went to France in 1917 and died for the cause of freedom. From that journal, he read these words: "I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure, I will fight cheerfully, and I will do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended upon me alone." Throughout his life, Ronald Reagan bore our burdens as if the income did depend on him alone. We will all remember him as an unparalleled leader and an exceptional man who lifted our nation and set the world on a new path. President Reagan achieved greatness in his life. Some might even argue he transcended it. He could not have accomplished this without Nancy. Nancy is one of the finest first ladies these United States have ever known. And the love Ronald and Nancy Reagan shared touched the hearts of people everywhere. In 1989, President Reagan delivered his farewell address from the Oval Office. In that speech, the president spoke of the shining city on a hill that, after 200 years, 2 centuries, still stands strong and true on the granite ridge. Now it is our turn to thank Ronald Reagan for making us believe in that shining city. And as we say farewell, his last words as president echo across this nation. If we listen, we will hear him whisper the humble words he used to sum up his revolution. All in all, not bad at all.
Mrs. Reagan, Mr. Vice President, members of Congress, and distinguished guests, Ronald Reagan's long journey has finally drawn to a close. It is altogether fitting and proper that he has returned to this Capitol Rotunda. Like another great son of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, so the nation can say goodbye. This Capitol building is, for many, the greatest symbol of democracy and freedom in the world. It brings to mind the shining city on a hill, which President Reagan so often spoke. It is the right place to honor a man who so faithfully defended our freedom and so successfully helped extend the blessings of liberty to millions of people around the world. Mrs. Reagan, thank you for sharing your husband with us, for your steadfast love and for your great faith. We pray for you and for your family in this time of great mourning. But as we mourn, we must also celebrate the life and the vision of one of America's greatest presidents. His story and values are quintessentially American. Born in Tampico, Illinois, and then raised in Dixon, Illinois, he moved west to follow his dreams. He brought with him a Midwest optimism, and he blended it with a Western can-do spirit. In 1980, the year of the Reagan Revolution, his vision of hope, of growth, of opportunity was exactly what the American people needed and wanted. His message touched a fundamental core that is deeply embedded in the American experience. President Reagan dared to dream that America had a special mission. He believed in the essential goodness of the American people, and that we had a special duty to promote peace and freedom for the rest of the world. Against the advice of the timid, he sent a chilling message to authoritarian governments everywhere. that the civilized world would not rest until freedom reigned in every corner of the globe. While others worried, President Reagan persevered. When others weakened, President Reagan stood tall. When others stepped back, President Reagan stepped forward. And he did it all with great humility, with great charm, and with great humor. Tonight, we will open these doors and let the men and women who Ronald Reagan served so faithfully file past and say goodbye to a man who meant so much to so many. It is their being here that I think would mean more to him than any words that we may say. Because it was from America's great and good people that Ronald Reagan drew his strength. In the years ahead, we will tell our grandchildren about this night when we gathered here to honor the man from Illinois who became the son of California and then the son of all America. And then our grandchildren will tell their grandchildren, and President Reagan's spirit and eternal faith in America will carry on. Ronald Reagan helped make our country and this world a better place to live. But he always believed that our best days were ahead of us, not behind us. I can still hear him say, with that twinkle in his eye, "You ain't seen nothing yet." President Reagan once said, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." 20 years ago, President Reagan stood on the beaches of Normandy to honor those who made a life by what they gave. Recalling the men who scaled the cliffs and crossed the beaches in a merciless hail of bullets, he asked, who were these men? These ordinary men doing extraordinary things. His answer was simple and direct. They were Americans. So I can think of no higher tribute or honor or title to confer upon Ronald Reagan than just to simply say he was an American. Godspeed, Mr. President. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Mrs. Reagan, members of the President's family, colleagues, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, fellow citizens. Knowing that this moment would come has not made it any easier to see the honor guard and the flag draped before us and to begin America's farewell to President Ronald Reagan. He said goodbye to us in a letter that showed his great courage and love for America. Yet for his friends and for his country, the parting comes only now. And in this national vigil of mourning, we show how much America loved this good man and how greatly we will miss him. A harsh winter morning in 1985 brought the inaugural ceremony inside to this rotunda. And standing in this place for the 50th presidential inauguration, Ronald Reagan spoke of a nation that was hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That was how he saw America, and that is how America came to know him. There was a kindness, simplicity, and goodness of character that marked all the years of his life. When you mourn a man of 93, no one is left who remembers him as a child in his mother's arms. Ronald Wilson Reagan's life began in a time and place so different from our own, in a quiet town on the prairie on the 6th of February, 1911. Nell and Jack Reagan would live long enough to see the kind of man they had raised, but they could never know all that destiny had in store for the boy they called Dutch. And if they could witness this scene in 2004, their son taken to his rest with the full honors of the United States, they would be so proud of all he had done with the life they gave him and the things they taught him. President Reagan once said, "I learned from my father the value of hard work and ambition and maybe a little something about telling a story." That was the Ronald Reagan who confidently set out on his own from Dixon, Illinois during the Great Depression, the man who would one day speak before cameras and crowds with such ease and self-command. "From my mother," said President Reagan, "I learned the value of prayer. My mother told me that everything in life happened for a purpose. She said all things were part of God's plan, even the most disheartening setbacks, and in the end, everything worked out for the best." This was the Ronald Reagan who had faith not just in his own gifts and his own future, but in the possibilities of every life. The cheerful spirit that carried him forward was more than a disposition. It was the optimism of a faithful soul who trusted in God's purposes and knew those purposes to be right and true. He once said, "There's no question I am an idealist," which is another way of saying, "I am an American." We usually associate that quality with youth, and yet one of the most idealistic men ever to become president was also the oldest. He excelled in professions that have left many others jaded and self-satisfied, and yet somehow remained untouched by the worst influences of fame or power. If Ronald Reagan ever uttered a cynical or cruel or selfish word, the moment went unrecorded. Those who knew him in his youth and those who knew him a lifetime later all remember his largeness of spirit, his gentle instincts, and a quiet rectitude that drew others to him. Seen now at a distance, his strengths as a man and as a leader are only more impressive. It's the nature of the city of Washington that men and women arrive, leave their mark, and go their way. Some figures who seemed quite large and important in their day are sometimes forgotten or remembered with ambivalence. Yet nearly a generation after the often impassioned debates of the Reagan years, what lingers from that time is almost all good. And this is because of the calm and kind man who stood at the center of events. We think back with appreciation for the decency of our 40th president and respect for all that he achieved. After so much turmoil in the 60s and 70s, our nation had begun to lose confidence, and some were heard to say that the presidency might even be too big for one man. That phrase did not survive the 1980s. For decades, America had waged a Cold War, and few believed it could possibly end in our own lifetimes. The president was one of those few, and it was the vision and the will of Ronald Reagan that gave hope to the oppressed, shamed the oppressors, and ended an evil empire. More than any other influence, the Cold War was ended by the perseverance and courage of one man who answered falsehood with truth and overcame evil with good. Ronald Reagan was more than an historic figure. He was a providential man who came along just when our nation and the world most needed him. And believing as he did that there is a plan at work in each life, he accepted not only the great duties that came to him, but also the great trials that came near the end. When he learned of his illness, his first thoughts were of Nancy. And who else but Ronald Reagan could face his own decline and death with a final message of hope to his country, telling us that for America, there is always a bright dawn ahead. Fellow Americans, here lies a graceful and a gallant man. Nancy, None of us can take away the sadness you are feeling. I hope it is a comfort to know how much he means to us and how much you mean to us as well. We honor your grace, your own courage, and above all, the great love that you gave to your husband. When these days of ceremony are completed, the nation returns him to you for the final journey to the West. And when he is laid to rest under the Pacific sky, we will be thinking of you as we commend to the Almighty the soul of his faithful servant, Ronald Wilson Reagan.
Let us bow for the benediction. O giver of every good and perfect gift, accept our gratitude for the life of your servant, President Ronald Reagan, whose love for freedom summoned our nation to embrace our best hopes and not our worst fears. Thank you for his ability to plant seeds of confidence and not doubt, and to lift liberty's lamp until totalitarian towers tumbled. In the days to come, remind us of America's opportunity to remain a shining city on a hill. Continue to comfort those who mourn. In a special way, be near to Mrs. Nancy Reagan and the family. May the death of this beloved leader prompt us to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly day by day. Now fill us with your peace as we trust you, so that we may overflow with hope by the power of your Spirit. Amen.
rotunda of the Capitol of the United States ends, in a few minutes, the public will be allowed to begin filing past the casket. One of the many indelible scenes of this day, Nancy Reagan escorted to the casket by Vice President Dick Cheney, stepped alone to the flag that covered the casket. The former First Lady stroked and patted the casket before leaving for the evening, stroked and patted it as though she were reassuring him that all would be all right. And then came the eldest son, Michael, who came up to the casket, patted it, blew a kiss, saluted, turned and walked away. On the steps of the casket, of the Capitol, as the president's casket reached its landing outside the Capitol building, Nancy Reagan had reached out and touched the casket. She gazed at it as she had been known so long for, gazing at him through speeches, ceremonies long and short, big and small, while he was still living.
We talked earlier, Dan, about the difference in this day and that day in 1963 when you had the funeral of John Kennedy. The nation was in shock. We were going through this terrible trauma. It was much different today. This was a day of a feeling, I think, when people said or felt as if they were saying goodbye to an old friend. It was a much happier kind of occasion, it seemed to me. And it reflected the cheerfulness, I think, of Ronald Reagan.
Of course, perhaps the biggest difference between those 4 dark days in 1963 was that President Kennedy was slain young by an assassin's bullet. Ronald Reagan, up to including this time, lived longer than any other American president. Ronald Reagan's biographer, Edwin Morris.
My thoughts looking at this rotunda are the measure of what he achieved is what we don't see anymore. Where's Soviet Union? Where is the Berlin War? Where's national malaise? Where's double-digit inflation? All these things are gone now, in large part because of his presidency.
Ed Rollins, who was at President Reagan's side, helping to direct his 1980 winning campaign for the presidency, directed the 1984 winning 49 states landslide. As you listened and watched, particularly this closing ceremony in Rotunda, your thoughts?
My thoughts are these. Just like Kennedy, Kennedy was frozen in time. We'll always think of Kennedy as a young, dynamic man, didn't see him grow old. Even though Ronald Reagan was in his 70s, we'll always see him as a vigorous man. And the pictures this last week emoted all that, and we'll always see him as a very beloved man. The one whose image may be changed by today was Mrs. Reagan, who still as beautiful as she's ever been. But she was so stoic, and people always saw them together, but today they saw her standing there with the great strength that I've always known that she had. And that's what I think was really touching today.
Outside the Capitol, the people, we the people of the United States, have lined up, some as you can see with baby carriages, to await their turn to file past the casket. In California at the Presidential Library, the President Ronald Reagan Library, in Simi Valley, well over 100,000 filed pass. Here in the capital of the United States, it's estimated that 200,000 or more may file past. They are not quite yet ready to allow them into the rotunda. Some of the dignitaries have lingered, but the public will soon, very soon, be allowed in here. And the president's body will lie in state tonight, tomorrow night. Then on Friday morning, it will be moved from here for the formal official funeral services at the cathedral, at the Washington National Cathedral. There, President George W. Bush will speak. President Bush today is at the G8 Economic Summit in Georgia. But he will be coming back to make his funeral oration on Friday. And then after that, at the National Cathedral on Friday, Ronald Reagan will be taken back to his final resting place in California, overlooking the Pacific Ocean at his library in Simi Valley. As you look from above, the high shot above the rotunda, for those of you who were not able to be with us or did not choose to be with us through the afternoon, and for those of you who were, we'll now give you a look at some of the sights and sounds that unfolded on this afternoon. At ceremonies, as the ceremonies end, underneath the dome of the United States Capitol, the sun has set. It's twilight time in Washington. We also near the end of an historic day in this capital city. And as the sun completes its westward transit and the sky dims, those who have come to our nation's capital and have waited these many hours to pay their respects will begin to pass by the casket that contains the earthly remains of Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th President of the American Republic. Their passage will continue for hours through the dark night and into tomorrow. All come so that, in the words of Catullus, that they may give the last gifts to the dead. The gifts they bring on this June evening are the gifts of respect and of fond farewell to a fellow citizen whom they esteemed greatly and whose time among them now approaches its close. Now, just ahead for most of you, a special edition of 60 Minutes 2. And for those of you in the West, our coverage will continue. Dan Rather reporting from Washington.
People have passed through the U.S. Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects to our 40th president. Good morning. This is Fox News special coverage. Farewell to President Ronald Reagan. I'm Britt Hume in Washington. On this day, this country will bid a fond and final farewell to Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th President of the United States. And as you can see in the picture there, a motorcade is forming outside the U.S. Capitol, which will carry his body to the United States, the National Cathedral, across town and up at the highest point in the city, where a national service will be conducted for him. There is a picture of that great cathedral, construction on which was begun in 1907 and completed gradually over many, many years. For more than an hour, people who were invited to this event, and everyone there is to be by invitation. And there's a beautiful rose window in the cathedral. Been coming into this enormous church to participate in this ceremony. There will be speeches, brief eulogies by former President Bush, on tape by Margaret Thatcher, who was, of course, a great and good friend of President Reagan and a political ally who made the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States stronger than ever. Former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney will also speak, as will President Bush. The ceremony will be presided over by John Danforth, a man well known to many in Washington. We were accustomed, most of us, however, to seeing him in street clothes. He was a United States Senator for a number of years. He is now President Bush's nominee to be the new ambassador to the United Nations. But John Danforth of Missouri is also an ordained Episcopal minister, and he will be the principal officiating officer at this ceremony. That is the nave of the cathedral, and there is the bier on which the president's casket will be placed for this service, set to begin now in about an hour and a half. In the meantime, of course, when the former First Lady Nancy Reagan comes to the Capitol, there will be a ceremony as her husband's body is carried out and made a part of this motorcade. There you see the live picture of the president's body, the former president's body, lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Joining me here as we watch cover these events are Fox News contributors Fred Barnes, executive editor of the Weekly Standard, Mort Kondracki, executive editor of Roll Call, and we're pleased also to be joined today by Ann Gerhard, correspondent of the Washington Post, who has written this week on the plans, the elaborate plans that have been a part of these funeral observances for Ronald Reagan. Pleased to have you all. Some thoughts this morning on these proceedings. Fred Barnes?
Well, you know, one of the things that struck me is what was not planned. Ronald Reagan had been out of public life for 10 years. He left the presidency 15 years ago. Frankly, I think most people didn't think there would be this great interest, this strong remembrance, the reassessments and assessments of Ronald Reagan's career as a politician and as president. And yet, it's built all week toward this ceremony today. The interest all over the country, the people lined up for hours to go pay respects in the Rotunda in the Capitol. It's really become a huge event,
much bigger than I think any of us had any reason to believe.
I think it bespeaks a desire on the part of the country for national unity at a time, we're in the middle of a nasty presidential campaign, and this gives us a chance to bind ourselves again, or unite ourselves around a very popular president who accomplished great things and deserves all the adoration that he's receiving now.
And Gerhardt, one senses that this building effect that Fred was talking about is very much what Nancy Reagan had in mind in choreographing these proceedings.
Well, she's always been interested in protecting his legacy. She is a wife first and foremost in all ways, and that was her aim. Although she herself was really stunned by the outpouring of affection on the way from the funeral home in California to the Reagan Library, where he lay in state in California. She told her old friend Merv Griffin in the car that she was just surprised how many people came. And she said, I thought they forgot him. He was out of the public eye for 10 years.
Yeah, out of the public eye for 10 years indeed, and also, of course, out of office, as Fred remarked earlier, for 15 years. It is a bit remarkable, the extent of this outpouring for him. Certainly the sheer force and weight of these proceedings, the state occasion, has obviously added something to this and made it, I think, more compelling. It is a reminder of that for all the divisions that we are a nation that does come together from time to time in striking unity. Now you see Mrs. Reagan entering now the Capitol Rotunda. And now Nancy Reagan, on the arm of Major General Galen Jackman, who is the commander of the Military District of Washington, will head down and wait outside while the president's casket is brought down. It is no small undertaking to lift this enormous coffin, weighing by some estimates as much as 700 pounds, down steps and out from the rotunda, which is on the second floor of the Capitol, and then outside. Now, the west front of the Capitol has been used for the entrances and exits in these ceremonies, and it is steeper and longer down that way than it is out the other side, but it is also certainly more picturesque and more splendid view of the Capitol, and from the Capitol a more splendid view of the city. There you see this hearse, which has the presidential seal on it, as you probably noted, all a single vehicle waiting downstairs for the president's casket to be brought down. Crowds, as you can see, are large and have been, as we've noted, all through this remarkable week of observances for Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th President of the United States.
about. Hey.
This is, of course, the scene at the National Cathedral across town. No, I'm sorry, it's not. This is the these are the pallbearers, honorary pallbearers, who are. You see Merv Griffin, a great family friend, in the front there on the right, and then on the back on the left there, it appears to be Mike Deaver, who was a senior member of the president's inner circle, and a man who is widely credited with the fine touch that the Reagan White House always seemed to show for ceremonial events, pictures, and so on. Mike Deaver, very close to Nancy Reagan. These, of course, are the Reagan children. On the left there you see Ron and his wife Doria. That, of course, on her right, Doria's right, is Patty Davis, their daughter, Michael, the former president's adopted son during his marriage to Jane Wyman, and his wife. These members of the family have been a bit in the background in the proceedings to date. Many observers have noted that the marriage between Ronald and Nancy Reagan was a very intimate, very powerful relationship, and one in which they were both so satisfied with each other's company that they oftentimes didn't seem to need or particularly want the company of others. Some have said that that tended to exclude the Reagan children. Nonetheless, they are all here and will be very much a part of this.
Ready, 2. Ready, 2. Ready, 2. Color, about